Okay, so we are on chapter 6 now, which is bone tissue. So we're starting the skeletal system, we're starting bones. We're going to talk about the tissue that bones are made up of first. So we're going to talk about the functions, we're going to talk about the histology, we're going to talk about how bones are formed, how they're repaired, how homeostasis and calcium is maintained, and of course exercising and aging in bone and how it impacts it. So, first, the skeletal system is made up of bones, cartilage, tendons, which connect muscle to bone, and ligaments, which connect bone to bone. Each individual bone is actually considered an organ, and I want you guys to consider why for a second. If you think about it, organs, the definition of an organ, are different tissues that come together and work for a specific function. Well, each bone is actually made up of different tissue types. So each bone is actually technically an organ. The tissues that are associated with bone are osseous tissue, which of course is the bone itself, cartilage, dense connective tissue proper, adipose tissue, which all of those are connective tissue, and then nervous tissue and blood, of course. Osteology is the study of bone structure and the treatment of bone disorders. So anything that goes wrong with the bone, you're going to see. If you're studying this, you're an osteologist technically. The functions are support, of course, providing the framework for the body. Our muscles will attach to it to help our body move as well. So skeletal muscles attached to the bones by tendons. Protection from damage. Their internal organs are protected, especially the ribs, protecting our thoracic cavity, so our heart and our lungs. It stores and releases minerals, usually calcium and phosphorus, and also these contribute to the strength of the bone. Bones are relatively strong. It takes quite a bit to break them, unless something is going on, of course. Blood production, hemopoiesis, happens in the red bone marrow. This is where all of our blood cells are formed, which you will learn about in AMP2. Adipocytes, fibroblasts, macrophages as well. Triglyceride storage with adipocytes in the yellow marrow. So in the fetus and newborn, all of the marrow is actually red. With age, that red marrow starts to be replaced with yellow marrow. So in adults, the red marrow only stays located in the spongy bone, the ribs, the sternum, the skull, flat bones speaking, vertebrae, pelvis, irregular shaped bones, and the proximal ends of the femur and the humerus, so our long bones. Spongy bone and compact bone are the two types of bone that we have, and we will talk about shapes of bone as well. So, bones are classified by shapes. 80% are compact bone, 20% of them are spongy bone. Spongy bone kind of usually is in the middle of the compact bone, except when you're talking about long bones, then it's on the end of the long bone. Spongy bone does perform certain functions. It is very cancellous, meaning that it has a lot of holes in it, basically, so it reduces the weight and is also hemopoietic, which means blood cell formation. So a long bone, as the name implies, is long, so longer than it is wide. A short bone is, as the name implies, again, short, so just as wide as it is long. A flat bone, again, as the name implies, is flat. And a regular bone, guess what, as the name implies, is irregularly shaped. And then we have sesamoid bones, which the main one is the patella, or your kneecap. So long bones, again, greater length than width, mostly made of compact bone with inner spongy bone at the ends. So the ends of the bone have spongy bone. Those are called the epiphyses. The shaft, or the middle of the bone, is called the diaphyses. The medullary cavity is in the center of the long bone, and then the shaft, basically. Examples: the femur, the tibia, the fibula in your lower limb, in your upper limb, the humerus, the radius, and the ulna. And then, of course, our phalanges, the fingers and toes. Those are actually long bones. A lot of people will look at the phalanges and think they're considered short bones because they're so short. But remember, long bones are just longer than they are wide, and your phalanges are longer than they are wide, so they're officially long bones. Short bones are basically equal in length and width. They're cube-shaped. Spongy bone is in the inside, and then you have a thin layer of compact bone surrounding it. There isn't a medullary cavity in these bones, and the examples are your carpals, which are your wrist bones, and your tarsals, which are your ankle bones. Flat bones, we have the thin layer of spongy bones sandwiched between two layers of compact bones. Again, no medullary cavity. You're going to find these in your skull, the sternum, which is your breastbone, and the scapula, which is your shoulder blade. Irregular, again, are odd-shaped. There's various amounts of spongy bone inside with an outer layer of compact bone. Again, no medullary cavity. Your vertebrae, your facial bones, your hip bone, your coxal bone, and your heel, which is your calcaneus, are considered irregular bones. Sesamoid, certain tendons have these, and they're not actually always completely ossified, so they're not always hardened all the way. The best example is the patella. They're typically millimeters in diameter, but their point is to prevent wear and tear on tendons, so they're very important. Sutural bones are small bones between the cranial structures, or sutures, sorry. So you're going to find those in the skull. When we talk about the skull, we'll talk more about those bones. So, short, flat, and irregular bones are composed mainly of inner spongy bone and then an outer layer of compact bone. Spongy bone is also located at the proximal end of long bones, and some of the spongy bones are actually filled with red marrow, which is where blood cells are produced, so it's hemopoietic. So, gross anatomy of the long bone. The structure of the bone is designed to provide maximum strength, so there's a slight curvature to it with minimum weight, so they're hollowed out. So they have either spongy bone or the medullary cavity. The gross anatomy of a long bone, you can look at the picture of the humerus in your book. The diaphysis is the shaft or the body of the bone, so the center of the bone. The epiphyses are the ends, so the distal and proximal ends of the bone. And the metaphyses joins the diaphyses and the epiphyses. And yes, this is a lot of physes, but you need to know them. Growing bone actually adds length, so they grow in length as opposed to width for the most part. The epiphyseal plate in children is what allows for growth in length. And basically what that is it's hyaline cartilage, and then the cartilage is replaced with bone. In adults, when you know growth is over, it actually becomes the epiphyseal line. So you have hyaline cartilage completely turned to bone. So there's no longer a plate. So that's actually how doctors can tell if a child has stopped growing. They can take an x-ray, and if they see that epiphyseal line, they know that the child is done growing. Articular cartilage is hyaline cartilage, so one of the three types of cartilage, the weakest cartilage, but the most abundant in the body. It covers the epiphyses at the joint, which joints are also called articulations, so it's going to cover the ends of the long bones where the joints meet. It reduces friction and helps absorb shock, and oftentimes it'll wear down over time, so this is why people have a lot of issues with their knees especially, because the articular cartilage on the bones and the tendons and ligaments surrounding the knees start to wear down, which we'll talk about that later too. The periosteum is the outer layer covering the bone. This helps protect and nourish the bone. It's dense, irregular connective tissue, so it can withstand pulling in multiple directions. The inner layer is osteogenic, so that helps bones grow in length and repair them. This is where ligaments and the tendons are attached to. The medullary cavity is the inner hollow space that contains the fatty yellow bone marrow. It's highly vascular, so that is why it does hurt when you break a bone. And the endosteum is the thin layer that lines the inside of the medullary cavity, It's actually a layer of osteogenic cells, which are the precursors to the bone cells, basically, which we'll talk about in a minute, and connective tissue. So here's the humerus. You can see spongy bone in the proximal epiphysis, articular cartilage on the ends. The epiphyseal line is in the proximal epiphyses. You can see that there. So this is an adult bone. The metaphyses is where the epiphyses and the diaphysis meet. So you're going to have one on the proximal end and one on the distal end. The medullary cavity, the hollow center, compact bone is what basically makes up the medullary cavity. The endosteum lines the inside of the medullary cavity, and you can see the blood vessels going through. The periosteum is the outer covering, and that is everything. So, microscopically speaking, the bone's hardness depends on how much crystallized inorganic mineral salts there are. If you actually remove the mineral salts from the bone, it's kind of rubbery. And you can actually do this in a lab. You can actually soak the bones and remove those mineral salts, and then when you pick the bone up, it kind of becomes rubbery. Calcification is the process of crystallization of the mineral salts within the collagen fibers. This is initiated by osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are the bone building cells. Osteoclasts are the bone carving cells. They break bone down, basically. So osteoblasts build, osteoclasts carve. So if you just remember blasts build, clasts carve, hopefully you can keep them straight. And a bone's flexibility or tensile strength actually depends on its protein collagen fibers. If you bake bones, they actually become really brittle and they break really easily. So this is a nice little chart that shows you the cells and the matrix in bone tissue. So the osteogenic cells are the unspecialized stem cells. These undergo mitosis and actually produce osteoblasts. They're concentrated in the inner layer of that periosteum. Again, the osteoblasts are the bone building cells, so they make the matrix. They cannot divide. They actually initiate calcification, and then what happens is as they get mature and older, they get walled off into the bone tissue, and they become mature osteocytes. Osteocytes are the mature bone cells that actually maintain the bone. They don't divide anymore. They can't divide, just like osteoblasts cannot divide. Osteocytes cannot divide, but they do maintain that matrix. They maintain that metabolism. So they make sure that the bone tissue basically has everything that they need. They're again surrounded by lacuna, just like chondrocytes are, just like cartilage cells are. So osteogenic cells are unspecialized. They differentiate into osteoblasts, and then osteoblasts will mature into osteocytes. Osteoclasts are actually derived from the white blood cell stem line. These are the bone destroying cells, so they secrete hydrolytic enzymes that are really powerful, and they break down that matrix. Again, these are concentrated in the endosteum. So blasts build, clasts carve, and blasts will actually mature into osteocytes. The matrix is 15% water, 30% collagen, and 55% crystallized mineral salts. So again, collagen gives it its kind of flexibility, and the mineral salts give it its hardness. So bone remodeling is what happens normally. It's a continual process where our bone renews itself. So what happens is osteoclasts are continuously breaking down our bone, and osteoblasts are continuously rebuilding it. So the bone resorption happens with the osteoclasts breaking down the bone. The bone deposition happens with the osteoblasts laying down new bone and creating new matrix. So when resorption occurs, calcium and the other minerals are going to be released into the interstitial fluid. then it'll move into the plasma and be used for other metabolic functions like nerve impulses, blood clotting, muscle contractions. So if our blood calcium is off, what will happen is a signal will be sent, and the osteoclasts will break down bone to raise our blood calcium, or osteoblasts will build bone to take calcium out of the blood and deposit it into the bone. So that's one way that our calcium is maintained. Compact bone, so the outer portion, it has an osteon, which are actually repeating structural units. They run parallel to the length of the diaphysis, and these osteons are what give bone its structure and appearance under a microscope. So when you looked at the tissue picture of compact bone, the osteons were those circles that you saw repeating. The lamellae, you have concentric, interstitial, and circumferential. That's basically calcified matrix. Concentric are the ones that go around in the circles. Interstitial fill in the spaces between the osteons, and circumferential go all the way around the outside and inside of the bone. The lacuna are spaces within the lamella that house the osteocytes, and the osteocytes are the mature bone cells. Canaliculi are channels that are interconnected with extracellular fluid, and these are what actually connect the lacuna. So it provides nutrients and removes waste, so those osteocytes within the lacuna can make sure that the matrix is as it's supposed to be and that the bone has everything that it needs. Perforating or Volkmann's canals run transversely. They contain blood and lymph vessels and nerves, and they connect with the central canal, which the central or Haversian canal runs parallel, so it goes down, and that has lymph, blood vessels, and nerves as well. So if you think of something that perforates something, it kind of punctures holes in it, kind of. So the perforating canals kind of puncture holes in the sides of the bone and then run transverse. The central canal runs parallel, so it runs down. Spongy bone is towards the interior, again, has the red marrow, and it's protected by the compact bone as it is harder. It is made up of trabeculae, not osteons. They are thin columns of lamellae that kind of are arranged in an irregular pattern. They kind of weave in and out of the whole space. So again, no osteons, no perforating canals, no central canals. So if you look in the outside, that's compact bone. If you look towards the inside of the picture, that is spongy bone. So there's an osteon. The concentric lamellae, again, make up the osteons. The interstitial lamellae are between osteons, and basically what happens is as bone is remodeled, the old osteons kind of get broken down, and the interstitial lamellae are what are left. And then the circumferential lamellae go around the outside and the inside of the bone, and that's the newest growth. There's a lacuna with the osteocyte inside. The canaliculi are the canals that connect them. And if you look, it's blown up from the actual picture, so you can see all those dots, which are the osteocytes and lacuna. Volkmann's canal or perforating canals run transverse. Haversian canals run parallel. Then there's the trabeculae from the spongy bone. And compact bone. Periosteum is the outer covering, so you have the osteogenic layer on the inside, the dense connective tissue on the outside. So arteries and veins, you have the epiphyseal, metaphyseal, and periosteal, and then the nutrient. Nerves, again, accompany blood vessels, and you can see in the picture the epiphyseal and, of course, the epiphyses, the metaphyseal and the metaphyses. And then the nutrient artery and vein kind of run into the medullary cavity, and then the periosteal artery and vein are nourishing the periosteum. The nutrient foramen is a hole where the nutrient large artery and vein enter through the periosteum. of the diaphysis into the medullary cavity. There's proximal and distal branches, and basically it serves the inner bone tissue and the spongy tissue. Oops, I always do that at least once. Okay, so bone formation, ossification. This is how bone is formed. 4 times this happens. The formation of the bones in the embryo up to 2 months, and the fetus the 3rd month to birth. It also happens when bones grow during infancy to adulthood. You have what's called interstitial growth, so they get longer. Remodeling of the bone throughout life causes appositional growth, so they are modeled on the outsides, basically. And then, of course, with repair of bone fractures. So first of all, formation of the bones in the embryo and fetus. The embryonic skeleton is actually made of mesochyme, which is that embryonic connective tissue we've talked about before. It involves replacement of pre-existing connective tissue with bone. So intramembranous ossification is when bone forms within the mesenchyme in sheets. Formation of flat bones of the skull is not complete at birth, so you actually have soft spots, which are called fontanelles, in the newborn skull, especially at the top of the head and then the back of the head. If you've ever held or seen a newborn, you can actually kind of see the indentation a little bit at the top and in the back. You have to be very careful because the bones are not completely formed, so this is actually dense connective tissue, so the newborn can get hurt if something happens to those spots. So what happens is an ossification center develops because chemical signals were sent. You have a mesenchymal cell cluster form. Those cells then differentiate into osteogenic cells, which will then differentiate and mature into osteoblasts. The osteoblasts will then secrete the collagen fibers to form that extracellular matrix of the bone. Once the osteoblasts mature into osteocytes, they're walled off in lacuna, and calcium and mineral salts are deposited into the extracellular matrix, so the bones become hard and calcification occurs. The extracellular matrix then forms trabeculae, which is the spongy bone, and vascularization occurs. So it kind of starts weaving in and out. And then the periosteum develops. The mesenchyme that's left condenses and develops into the periosteum. Over time, that thin layer of compact bone will develop from some of the spongy bone during remodeling. So here's a picture. You have that ossification center, and the osteoblasts secrete that extracellular matrix. The calcium salts are deposited. The osteocyte is now in the lacuna, and newly calcified bone matrix is forming. And then you have that kind of weaving in and out of the trabeculae, and the vascularization also occurs. And then what is left over develops into the periosteum, so it kind of looks like a sandwich. So if you think of interchondral ossification, you're talking about between cartilage ossification kind of thing, so bone forming between cartilage kind of thing. So these are flat bones. These are how flat bones are formed. The majority of the bones are formed by endochondral ossification. So the bone forms within the hyaline cartilage. So what happens again, you still have the mesenchymal cell clusters. However, now they differentiate into chondroblasts. The chondroblasts secrete the cartilage within the perichondrium. The chondroblasts become walled off, and the chondrocytes undergo mitosis. Once the extracellular matrix starts to calcify, though, the chondrocytes actually start to die. You develop a primary ossification center and secondary ossification centers. The primary ossification center is the diaphysis, so that is the shaft of the bone. The bone tissue will replace most of the cartilage. So the perichondrium, which is the periosteum, turns into osteogenic cells. The osteogenic cells differentiate into the osteoblasts, and they deposit that calcified matrix over the calcified cartilage. And this is going to form trabeculae, so spongy tissue. Osteoclasts will break down some of the trabeculae and form the medullary cavity. Then the inner wall of that diaphysis is replaced by compact bones from the diaphysis to the epiphyseal ends. Then, as I said, you have secondary ossification centers that develop in the epiphyses. It's similar to primary ossification, except that the spongy bone remains and the medullary cavity is not formed. So what happens in a nutshell is you start out with cartilage, and then over time, a primary ossification center happens in the middle of the shaft of the bone. The osteogenic cells differentiate into osteoblasts, which secrete the calcified matrix. The trabeculae starts to get broken down and is replaced by compact bone in areas. Then the secondary ossification centers develop in the epiphyses. Again, spongy bone remains there and no medullary cavity is formed. Finally, the articular cartilage on the ends is formed, and that epiphyseal growth plate is formed. The hyaline cartilage stays there while the infant and child are growing, and then over time it's gradually replaced with bone, so that by the time the child is done growing, it becomes an epiphyseal line. So you have primary ossification in the diaphysis, secondary ossification in the epiphyses. So here's a picture showing you, so you can see mostly cartilage to start out, and then over time that primary ossification center develops in the shaft of the bone. The bone matrix is secreted, calcification happens, and then the medullary cavity is cut out by the osteoclasts in a nutshell. Then you have your secondary ossification centers, one in each epiphyses, and the spongy bone actually stays intact. So the spongy bone stays, that articular cartilage on top stays, and the epiphyseal plate on the bottom stays. So the only cartilage that's replaced in the epiphyses is the middle portion, which is your spongy bone. And then, as I said, over time, that epiphyseal plate bone will continue to replace the cartilage. The child will continue growing, and over time, that epiphyseal plate will calcify itself. And when the child is done growing, that will become the epiphyseal line. And then you can see a 12-week fetus. You can see how much cartilage is actually still there. You have a lot of uncalcified areas. Infant to adult, you have two types of bone growth, the appositional and the interstitial. Appositional is width, basically, so it occurs on the outer surface. Interstitial adds length, so on the diaphysis and the epiphyseal plate. Interstitial growth, the resting cartilage is the first zone, basically. You don't have any growth happening here, and this actually anchors the epiphyseal plate to the epiphysis. The next area is proliferating cartilage. You have chondrocytes, which are stacked up, so growing cartilage. The third zone is hypertrophic cartilage, where you have mature chondrocytes. And then the fourth zone is calcified cartilage, where the extracellular matrix actually surrounds the chondrocytes and calcifies. So the old chondrocytes are replaced by bone there. Appositional growth, so width basically, the periosteal cells give rise to the osteogenic cells. Osteoblasts secrete the extracellular matrix. They're matured. They walled off into the lacuna. Ridges and grooves actually form in this process, and also the Haversian canal is created that encloses that blood vessel, forming new osteons. Bone tissue in the medullary cavity is being destroyed by osteoclasts, so the medullary cavity actually enlarges while the bone is increasing in thickness. Again, our bodies are constantly reshaping our bones, so they're constantly breaking down our bones and adding more bones to them, so that if you break a bone, for example, your bone, when it heals, it's not going to be exactly the same as it was before the break. Factors that affect this: minerals, calcium and phosphorus, of course. You need those to harden the bone. Vitamins A, C, and D for calcium absorption. Hormones like human growth hormone, thyroid hormones, parathyroid hormone, calcitonin. Those are all hormones involved with calcium regulation and also growth and metabolism. And we'll talk about that in Anatomy 2. And then exercise and aging, which we'll talk about later. Fractures, make sure you guys look at the table 6.1 with the different types of fractures. You guys will have to look at a picture and say if it's, open, comminuted, Pott's fracture, Callus fracture, whichever fracture it is. So make sure you look at those pictures. So here's the table for your convenience. But you can see an open or compound fracture actually kind of breaks the surface of the skin. Closed fracture does not. A comminuted fracture is kind of splintered and you end up with bone fragments. Green stick is a partial fracture. One side fractures, the other side does not. This is common in collarbones in children. So it kind of bends and then just one side cracks. Impacted, one end is forcibly driven or impacted into the other. Pott's fracture is when you often happens when you're walking and you kind of twist your ankle a little bit. Pott's fracture will occur. And Callus fracture often happens when you're trying to break a fall. If you're falling, so you put your hands out as an instinct, oftentimes the Callus fracture will occur. So fracture and repair. The first thing that happens is a hematoma forms, about 6 to 8 days. Phagocytes, osteoclasts remove the dead or damaged tissue, and you'll have this hematoma formation. The second stage is a fibrocartilaginous callus forms. So fibers, cartilaginous, kind of cartilage. So fibroblasts move in, collagen fibers in the periosteum form chondroblasts, and you have this fibrocartilaginous callus form. Then osteogenic cells come in with osteoblasts forming trabeculae and joining the ends of the fracture. So this is the bony callus formation. And then final stage is remodeling, where osteoclasts will reabsorb the dead broken bone tissue. Osteogenic cells will form a patch through the trabeculae network, and then osteoblasts will come in and lay down new matrix if necessary. So here's your picture. You have the hematoma forming, and then the fibrocartilaginous callus forming, finally the bony callus forming, and then remodeling. As I said, that healed fracture will always be able to be seen on x-rays, and your bone shape will not be the same again. Homeostasis for calcium has to be maintained on a daily basis. Parathyroid hormone stimulates osteoclast activity to break down bone and raise the blood calcium level. Calcitonin is the opposite, and to a lesser extent human growth hormone and the sex hormones, but they stimulate osteoblast activity to take calcium out of the blood and put it into the bone, therefore lowering serum calcium level. Vitamin D is needed for calcium absorption and the phosphate ions from the small intestine and reabsorption of those same ions in the kidneys. So vitamin D is crucial to bone formation in a nutshell. And as I said in the chapter on integumentary system, the skin does synthesize vitamin D, but it is in the inactive form. So it has to go to the liver to be processed into the active form that we can then use for calcium absorption. If you have to take a calcium supplement, also make sure vitamin D is in it, because if you take a calcium supplement and do not have enough vitamin D, it's kind of no point in taking the supplement because it's not going to be absorbed. So make sure if you're taking a calcium supplement, you have one with vitamin D in it. So hormones control all of this, and it's a carefully balanced thing, and as I said, it's regulated on a daily basis. So this is just a picture showing you, if you're a visual learner, So some sort of stimulus decreases your blood calcium. The parathyroid gland cells will detect that calcium concentration. Parathyroid hormone gene is going to be turned on. It's going to release parathyroid hormone, and then osteoclasts are going to increase bone reabsorption, so they'll break it down to release the blood into the blood. To release the calcium into the blood and increase blood calcium. The kidneys will also retain calcium in the blood and excrete phosphate in urine to produce calcitriol, which kind of helps parathyroid hormone to a lesser extent. Exercise, when we're under mechanical stress, the bone tissue will become stronger because mineral salts will be produced and deposited, collagen fibers will be produced and deposited. Unstressed bones become weaker. So astronauts in space actually suffer from a rapid loss of bone density because they do not use their bones. So that's why oftentimes if you see pictures of astronauts in space or little videos, they're trying to walk on treadmills and things because you do not have weight in space, so you're not stressing your bones. So astronauts continuously try to do that while they're in space. So basically, if you work out, your bones are going to become stronger. If you don't use your bones, they're going to become a lot weaker. The main mechanical stress on bones is gravity, actually. So gravity kind of helps you work out your bones to an extent. Also, our skeletal muscles pulling on our bones. So any kind of weight-bearing activity is also going to help increase the strength of your bones. As we age, of course, everything starts to go down, so we have a decrease in bone mass. Our sex hormones diminish as we start to enter middle age, especially in women after menopause. So women are really prone to bone disorders and breaks after falls because of this. Basically what happens is our bone resorption by osteoclasts starts to go faster than our bone deposition by osteoblasts. So we're breaking down bone faster than we're replacing it. Female bones are usually smaller and less massive than males to begin with, so females are more impacted by aging than males are. But males are still impacted. So we have two principal effects of aging: loss of bone mass and brittleness. So we lose calcium from our bones, and that's actually a symptom of osteoporosis. So your bones actually start to become more dense. They get holes in them almost. They're becoming porous. Brittleness, the collagen fibers that give the bone its tensile strength and protein synthesis also decrease with age. So they start to become more brittle, and you're more likely to have a break after a fall. This is what an osteoporotic bone looks like compared to a normal bone. As you can see, all of the kind of holes, and it's a lot more porous than a regular bone, a healthy bone. Again, our osteoclasts are moving faster to break down bone than our osteoblasts are moving to replace it. Oftentimes we have depleted calcium from the body, or we're not taking in enough calcium from the environment to the body. So this will occur, which is why oftentimes women are put on calcium supplements as they get older. Some other bone issues: osteomalacia is adult rickets basically. The bones do not calcify, so they fracture easily. Osteoarthritis is when that articular cartilage degenerates, and that causes friction between the bones and often a lot of pain. Osteomyelitis is an infection of the bone, often caused by Staph aureus, which is a bacteria. Osteopenia is a reduced bone mass in general, like osteoporosis. And osteosarcoma is bone cancer. Bone cancer is actually one of the toughest cancers to fight because once it infects your bones, it's very difficult to treat it. And this is just another animation. Make sure, again, if you're going to watch it, you're in slideshow mode, and you just click on it and it will run. Okay, well, that is all. As always, if you have any questions, just send me a message and let me know. Otherwise, that's it. Bye.